we talked about the Lederman hypothesis, which is basically oriented towards production and markets. There are two other approaches. One of them is called the problem-directed, and the other is direct intervention. Now, problem-directed is basically to ask ourselves, what's the biggest effect of unhealthy alcohol consumption on society, on individuals, on groups? So you identify the problem. So if the problem, for instance, is violence, if the problem, for instance, is drunk driving, if the problem, for instance, is unhealthy drinks, then it is far better in terms, instead of trying to suppress supply or trying to suppress total volumes, you direct policy at specific problems, because then you go through a scalpel approach as opposed to a sledgehammer approach. Sledgehammer and scalpel are my own words. So, and direct intervention, again, direct intervention would be, ask yourself, so what are we thinking is the biggest risk? And if the biggest risk is youth or underage people being exposed to this, then you solve that problem directly, as opposed to thinking that volumetric suppression on its own will necessarily go there. Our advice would be, for instance, for the ADCA to open up an opportunity for us to use problem-directed and direct intervention by identifying the biggest risks and then pushing in policies that specifically go for those risks. Why? Because you can measure their outcomes, and you also can calibrate very clearly what's the most cost-effective way to respond. Optimal taxation that accounts for elasticity of demand, which is what we've talked about. Basically, elasticity of demand is, if you raise taxes, you're assuming that by raising taxes, you're going to affect all drinkers the same. Obviously not. I think there are people who are close to a margin where even if prices go up, they may not change their behavior. So optimal taxation would be to determine what's the level at which a tax has the effect that is consistent with the public health outcomes or whatever other outcomes that we do, as opposed to specifically putting in taxes and saying, look, let it affect everybody in the same way, because people respond very differently to those measures. On the question of advertising and industry norms, and if you look at it, we used examples from 3 specific countries. We are sorry they're in Europe, but we found those as some of the most progressive. So we used an example from the UK, from France, and from Denmark. And among the things that it tells us is that there needs to be a little more trust in industry to actually, one, agree to norms together with the regulatory institution, and then to enforce those norms through their own self-regulation, with the industry coming in, or rather with the regulators coming in when there's serious breach of those. But it is possible, and it's consistent with public affairs, public interest rather, for industry to actually enforce those norms among themselves, because they understand the risks, and they actually can come up with very innovative ways of ensuring that those responsibility norms are done. And finally, one that we think is most important for Kenya is basically supporting responsible consumption to raise something that is called Drink IQ. I think a major industry player in Kenya is committed to this. I think has done quite some bit of education. We haven't seen the evaluation of it, but the case study that we have suggests to us that it's a very effective way of going about it. Again, because it's problem-directed as opposed to the Lederman hypothesis, which is basically just to suppress the volumetric consumption of alcohol.